Shanti, you have been presenting at Shanti Jones from Taos, New Mexico, has been presenting at more APPA meetings than I can remember, both live and lately online and around the world at ICPP conferences. Shanti is a very diverse kind of performer, entertainer, doing philo cabaret philo, which he's pioneered, writing a lot of very serious and excellent case studies using virtue ethics and other allied topics. So today, we're going to hear from her. She has a PhD in, I think, originally transpersonal psychology. She's APPA certified many years now and is an independent scholar in private practice. Her research interests include philosophical counseling and practice. She's published 13 articles on the subject and has presented her ideas at many, many philosophical conferences, both nationally and internationally. And today, Shanti is going to talk to us on the Pragmatics of Eudaimonia, lessons from Aristotle and Jane. The floor is yours, Shanti, and welcome. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me, Lou. I really appreciate it. Yeah, it's always a pleasure to be here every year. No one yet today, but on many other occasions, it's been said that the professional growth that can happen for philosophical counselors through APPA is, I'm one example of it. Through the years, just hearing other people's presentations and expanding my understanding personally and professionally has been invaluable to me. So thank you, Lou, and for everyone here that's been involved. Like I know Rick's now on the board too. Thank you for your efforts. I've greatly benefited. So today, what I want to do is I want to present a case about of a client of mine. She's no longer a client. I think I started seeing her about a year ago, and she ended up with a diagnosis at the age of 78 of supranuclear palsy, which of course brought up existential issues of things like limit situations, being death, and also bringing her life to fulfillment. So I want to talk about the specific case, but before that, I want to talk about, you can go on to the next slide after that too, Lou. I'd like to talk about my approach to philosophical counseling and why I think an approach is important. Next slide. At the last Agora meeting, it was, I think Rick said, he didn't really have an approach. And there was even an intimation that having an approach wasn't really necessarily important in philosophical counseling. And I'd just like to respectfully disagree with that idea, because I have found, since I developed this approach 8 years ago, and one of the reasons I went into philosophical counseling was because I wanted to philosophically support my work, was that it has a lot of benefits, and it can really shorten the time that a client spends in philosophical counseling if they know why they're there, how you're basically going to approach the work you're going to do together, and how you're going to go about it. So that, there's a logic, you're working within these traditions, there's a coherent body of knowledge. So it's actually more efficient to have an approach than not. Next slide. So my approach, which I'm going to talk about today, has 4 aspects to it. It has the aspect of virtue ethics, as Lou mentioned, and then also existentialism and pragmatism, and also experiences from phenomenology, which we would talk about as being mindfulness today. So in virtue ethics, because a lot of clients that I have don't really know how to judge things by their virtues. they don't know even what virtues are. So a part of my work almost always involves some kind of education for people. And over time, I've become more clear about which of the virtue ethics that are available are the most pragmatic and easiest to teach to clients. So next slide, please. So the first one that I, of course, rely on, when I first wrote the paper, I was calling it Aristotelian, but now I realize, thinking and learning more, that it's actually Neo-Aristotelian. And I think Alistair MacIntyre was the one that was primarily responsible for the term. And the reason this is important is because I was having problems when I first started explaining Aristotelianism to clients, because the idea of eudaimonia has really, as being happiness. I think everyone agrees that it's kind of limiting, and it's hard to really explain what Aristotle meant by that. And of course, Aristotle meant various other things by happiness, who could be happy, so we've changed those ideas, and we need to update Aristotle, and that's done in Neo-Aristotelianism. So like today, for example, eudaimonia is individually determined. The person sets the standards for themselves for the life that they find highly desirable. It isn't something that's put upon them. And I like it because, for example, Aristotle might not have thought that somebody who was, was mentally challenged or physically challenged could really have a eudaimoniacal life. And today we would say that if this person brought their life to a fulfillment that they could say they felt good about, and we also felt good about, we would consider them to be happy. So that's one of the virtue ethics that I rely upon. Next slide, please. And you'll see all throughout this, I use the pictures of philosophers that I'm referring to because it's also important. I found, like, we go around, we throw out these names, and the names are one-dimensional, and at least with the picture, and I will often bring out the book and show my clients the picture of the person so that it becomes less theoretical, and they realize that philosophers are really people. They're not just these books that lay on people's shelves. So I'm doing that today. Plus also I had a dream, where it's sort of Picasso picture of like myself hugging the philosopher and the philosopher hugging me with flowers, and I love these philosophers and I like to see their faces, and I hope you'll enjoy seeing them too. So of course, Kantian ethics, and it's amazing how many people really don't know about Kant and his two basic, principles that are so easy for people to remember, and I say to people, you don't want to, if you think it's okay to steal, okay, fine, nobody's going to see you, or to have a marital affair, maybe nobody sees you. But if everybody in the world acted that way, is that the kind of world that you want to live in? And I find that more helpful in many cases than do unto others as they would have you do unto them, because that's more hidden. Whereas I like the Kantian ethics because it really shows how things play out in the world, and about treating people as a means to an end, which goes also into existentialisms, being people seeing themselves as the subject of their lives, and also seeing other people as the subject of their lives. That's people's light bulbs go off in my clients' heads when they begin to think about other people as the subjects of their lives too, and not just the objects. Next slide, please. So another philosophy that I came across that I really found helpful with my clients is principlism. And principles are really great, because, well, we can remember them, but you don't want too many principles. And principlism, if you're not particularly familiar with it, it's now used in medical ethics quite a bit. And there are 4 basic ideas. So respect the autonomy of the individual, which goes back again to seeing them as the subject of their lives. seek the well-being of all people that are involved. And I like this, lessen the amount of harm. It's not do no harm, because sometimes that's impossible. But at least if there's going to be some kind of harm involved, lessen it to the greatest possible degree. And then the last one, be fair or justice. So again, because my clients often don't have any exposure to virtue ethics, I had to find some very simple, practical ways that I could just educate them along the way as they went to make decisions that would lead them towards their highest good. Next slide. So this is our own Andy Fitzgibbon. He's a certified philosophical counselor and a professor, and also the bishop of the community I belong to. And he feels that the ultimate telos of human beings is love. And so he has developed 12 virtues that can lead to persons being more loving. And this is really important in my work because, my clients have husbands, they have children, they have people that they work with, they have friends, and we talk about love, but then like, how do I have to explain to them about the difference between erotic love and agape and, the 4 different kinds of love? That gets complicated, but in all love, these virtues will enhance their ability to love and make them more loving people. And also sometimes I'll just go through the list if the person is interested in working on love as part of the philosophical work they're doing, and we'll just take one at a time and, go through a week or 2 on goodness or a week or 2 on no harm and talk about how they're either practicing that or not and how they can get better at it. Next slide, please. So those are the basic virtue ethics that I'm using that I find are very pragmatic. Then in existentialism, I find myself relying upon these kind of basic existential or thinking about them. So it's nice to have them in front of me a little bit or in front of you, because again, when the client comes, as they're talking and I'm making meaningful connections, then I can think about, okay, well, which of these existential issues would be, is involved here, and that leads me to, which philosophers could be helpful to the client in working with their issue. Next slide. So in phenomenology, this is Husserl, and in phenomenology, there's the basic idea of, dropping all presuppositions and being mindful. We would call it mindfulness today. He called it the phenomenological reduction. And also listening deeply for the meaningful connections as the client deepens into their experience. And because a lot of times people haven't made the connections as what's deeply meaningful in their life. And if they don't have these connections, they're kind of like a ship without a rudder. And the way I like to explain it to my clients is that every meaningful connection that you consciously make is like a thread in a rope. And the more meaningful connections that we find, that helps you to know more clearly what you value, and then how you rationally decide, ethically decide to care for what you value. So that's how I use the basic ideas from phenomenology. Next slide, please. So pragmatism. So one of the things that I have found over these last 8 years of using my approach is that my work is really pragmatic. I mean, to get to the highest good, for a person to reach their idea of what it is to flourish, you can't just talk about it. It's not just a theory. That you have to actually go out and do things, right? So, if I want to have a better life, if I want to have a better, and that includes a better occupation or a better marriage or a better relationship with my friends, I have to change the way I behave in the world. I have to change the way I do things. So pragmatism helps in 2 ways. One thing is just thinking that this is a pragmatic process. And the second thing is that, again, when clients try to decide what's the truth of things, or how should they decide, we talk about the ways that pragmatically how to decide is the outcome going to be positive for all the stakeholders or not? And if it is going to be positive, then you can feel that it's leading you towards something that's good or true or more beautiful. And that's a way to decide. So I didn't realize when I started my work in philosophical counseling how much I would rely on pragmatism, and how much I would be asking my clients to make pragmatic changes in their lives in order to achieve the highest good. The highest good is not just two words. It's a state of being that requires a disciplined approach in many different areas. Next slide. So what are the advantages to my approach? So here's my philosophical counselor, David Brendel. He's also a certified philosophical counselor, and he wrote a book called Healing Psychiatry. And I like to have his slide here and have the opportunity to talk about him, because actually this approach we developed together. When he started working with me almost 9 years ago, he didn't really have an approach. He just had been certified, and he was a psychiatrist, and he had a PhD in philosophy, but he didn't really know what was specific about philosophical counseling, what he was really going to be doing with me. And so as we went along, I told him what he was doing with me. What were we doing together? He would tell me things in philosophy, and we finally put this approach together. And so this approach that I've developed is out of my own experience, first of all, but now I've been using it for 8 years. And that's why I come back to tell you about it, because I'm more convinced than ever how well it works. So from David's help, the approach works because it's participatory with my client. We can draw from anything that makes sense. It's very pluralistic. And I love that, because when I was in psychology, it was harder to be pluralistic. And now I can draw upon anthropology, theology, philosophy, psychology. It's provisional. Like I say to my clients, we might decide a direction to go, and then we find out consequentially it didn't quite work the way we thought it was going to be. So we might have to change our directions. And again, back to pragmatism. Next slide, please. So again, like how to measure outcomes, like one of the articles that I read, and it was in the recent, this idea was brought up recently in the Facebook post that Rick put up, which was really great, on philosophical counseling. It was in a blog that I wasn't familiar with. But one of the complaints is, okay, you can't measure the outcomes of philosophical counseling. You haven't run all these tests and everything that show, why philosophical counseling works. And of course, here's Leon DeHaas. He's no longer with us, but he was very prominent in the philosophical counseling world for many, many years. And if you met him, you would really respect and care for him a great deal. And he's left behind many books that he's edited. And so he talked about how to measure outcomes. And I thought this was a very pragmatic way. And so if you are concerned about how to measure the outcomes with your clients and how to justify the work in the end, if it was good or not, I think these are good guidelines, which have been talked about earlier today. But first, you have to have a structured and guiding view that you can explain to someone else what you're doing. And then the conversations between the counselor and the client, how's it going? The client says, wow, I'm just so happy. You take somebody to a restaurant and you walk out and you say, was this a good meal? And they say, yeah, I loved it. Well, you don't have to take it to a scientist to, have another 100 people test whether this was a good meal or not. If everybody's walking out and saying it was a great meal, I think you can count on that. So, and that's like, are there relevant third parties, that, I know in my own life, I'd say my husband thinks I'm definitely a better wife due to the work I did with David in my philosophical counseling. He could definitely attest to that. And then behavioral measures, like are they exercising more? Are they eating better? You can look at those kinds of things as a way to evaluate your work. And then also, showing colleagues your work and discussing with them how their view is. So yeah, I found this very helpful because I'm always concerned about my work and am I doing the kind of work I really want to be doing? And this can be reassuring to you, and it has been to me. Next slide. So here's Carl Jaspers. He's one of my heroes. I like to say I spent many a good night in bed with Carl, reading his books. It was really good. Sometime I'm going to have a picture with me. So he talks about the value of philosophical counseling, saving people from, things that are miserable, debasing, and directing the people away from these kinds of behaviors that they feel makes them feel bad about themselves, and towards, a relationship that is, it's, well, like Kant says, if you're not being ethical, you're always going to be divided against yourself, right? And so once you start becoming ethical and living virtuously, you can be well grounded with yourself and other human beings. And one of the reasons I could renew my theological interest is because being a virtuous person allowed me to get closer to God. I didn't have to hide. So I love Carl Jaspers because I think this quote shows the maximum of what philosophical counseling can benefit others, in this approach. Next slide. And this is what happens with my client. Okay, so this is how philosophical counseling is helpful to my client, and now you know my approach, and now I'm going to show you how it was helpful with this client. Next slide. So progressive supranuclear palsy is it's a rare neurological disease. It's kind of like Parkinson's disease. And when so if you've known someone with Parkinson's, you see that their muscular neurological deterioration causes them not to be able to walk. And this, sometimes they can't swallow, they can't eat, they get trouble breathing, speaking. There's no effective treatment. There are some drugs that slow the progress down, but nothing that eradicates it. So there's some severe complications. And of course, my client was 78. So if you think a 15-year life expectancy from time of diagnosis, that's not so bad. She would be 93 when she died. Okay, fine. But it's those 15 years and how you have to live them, for one thing. And another thing, we all know that it's one thing to think, okay, I'm going to die someday. It's another thing to get a diagnosis and you have 6 months to live. Those are different confrontations. Next slide. So what are the existential issues that were raised for the client? Well, limit situations is one, because again, she's facing death, and then she's also had to face the fact that, she's going to be limited physically, like maybe not be able to walk. What if she can't talk? So that raises the issue of, who am I? Am I a person if I can't do those things anymore? And then it also raised the issue of, what is the meaning of my life? Did it all add up? And so she was angry and frightened, and anxiety is also another existential issue that has deeper roots than just cognitive behavioral changes of thinking. And we also needed to address those. Okay, next slide. So meaningful connections. So as I interviewed her, of course, there was, as I said, there was the fear, but the fear not just of the moment, but she had lived with fear all of her life, which is perhaps one of the reasons that she had supranuclear palsy, because anxiety can deteriorate your nervous system. So we not only had to look at the fear involved with the diagnosis, but the fear that she lived with all of her life and how it was exacerbating her condition. And her fear was so great that she had like dissociated dreams of fear. Like she would wake up in the middle of the night and see, strange figures on the roof, or she would imagine that she could see somebody peering into her windows. So it was a fear of an extreme degree. And I was concerned about the amount that those kinds of dissociated dreams, and I asked David about them, and he felt that they fell within normal, that she wasn't psychotic, but it was just when human beings become so frightened, one of the ways to deal with it is to dissociate. So she has a family, a daughter and son-in-law and two grandsons. And I think of course, they're very important to her. And before our work together, like many of us, casual in how she dealt with those relationships somewhat. And when she realized that they were really important and really, really important, and that she was going to leave her legacy behind with them, we did quite a few things, pragmatically speaking, to strengthen each one of those relationships. So, for example, like with her own daughter, her mother hadn't been warm with her, and so she wasn't as warm with her daughter as she would like her daughter to remember her. So we worked on her being, more physically demonstrative, more verbally demonstrative, and to strengthen and to deepen those kinds of meaningful connections that she had. She also was dealing with existential guilt. She had lost a son about 5 months after the son was born, and she all her life had felt responsible for the death of the son. So we had to go back and really rationally decide, was she guilty or not, and help her to come to peace with that. And we talked about her relationship with her mother. One of the things about my client was that she loved talking with people. She had a really nice charisma, and she'd only retired like maybe 5 years before, and she moved to Taos, which was a change. So she'd relied on her job and old friends just naturally to enjoy her deep and her enjoyment of people. But when she came to Taos and all that fell away, she didn't realize that this was really something that was an intrinsic part of her. And when she didn't have it, she wasn't happy. And also, because she had had it at work, where it was something that was just naturally done, to free form it out in the world with neighbors and people she didn't know if she could count on her charisma and her verbal abilities. And we really looked at that, and I assured her those were really deep parts of herself. And she enhanced her relationships with her neighbors and friends, and was more confident in the enjoyment that people had in conversing with her. She became more kind and giving. She already was, but again, we can all be better at it. We took care of the legal necessities, because of course, if your legal necessities aren't taken care of, and this is the pragmatic solutions, you are also going to be anxious. So during those 9 months, she took care of those kinds of things in her estate planning. And also her home, she had let it go, and we all know that in our personal environment, if we don't feel good in it, we can't be at peace. And so we went through her house and just, talked about what kinds of things would make her feel more beautiful in her home. And part of it was the organization wasn't as good as what it could be. So as we went along, we identified these things as the things that were most meaningful to her. So we knew what to work on. And then we set about deciding together pragmatically how she would be doing that. Next slide. So I think I already talked about the pragmatic solutions. They kind of went along with the meaningful connections. Next slide. So the highest good for Jane was, of course, to achieve, some kind of peace and about her life, so that she could die not afraid. And and the feeling that she had brought her life to fulfillment. Yeah, so I think we did achieve that. If you see the next slide. Yeah, happiness and peace. So she reestablished relationships with her friends and family. And in fact, on her birthday, she called me and yeah, which was about maybe 2 or 3 months after we terminated our work together. And it was her birthday, and she called to say that her neighbors had had a party for her. Her family was going to have another party for her. She was going to go out to lunch with a couple of other friends. And yeah, she was very ecstatic. And also she'd had a dream that compared to the dream that I mentioned earlier on, where she had these dissociated, frightening figures surrounding her. She had recently had a dream where she had a benevolent presence accompanying her, which enabled her to feel at peace. And we could say perhaps that the benevolent figure was me, but I also think that she, after dealing with these different things that she felt guilty about and felt afraid about from her life, that these allowed her to feel that she could accompany herself as a better friend to herself as well. So next slide. So she had a celebration and she shared it with me. And again, going back to how do we determine if our work is successful? Well, I go back and I say, next slide, that, if you have an approach, which my approach is based on virtue ethics, existentialism, phenomenology, and pragmatism, and you can explain it to the client clearly at the beginning so they know where they're going. We're going to work always towards your highest good. Okay. So that's reassuring to them. Going back, to other presentations today about, anger or, any issue. I don't know about you, but I can often feel when somebody brings up an issue that I get afraid because it's going to make me look less than, or it's going to make me look bad, or I'm going to, not be as good a person as I thought I was. But if everything that we deal with is oriented towards the highest good, then no matter what comes up, the client doesn't have to be afraid because they know that there is good that's going to come out of it. So I encourage people to think about their approach and see how it might be helpful to them and in their daily work. And aiming it towards the highest good is a valuable thing because no matter what the problem is, whether it's dealing with anger or body image, if the client knows they're moving in that direction, they're more reassured. Next, I think that's it. Thank you very much for your time, and I hope this was helpful to you too.